We are working on enhancing the laptop store project from the YByte Python curriculum available at www.ybyte.in. Uh, Previously, we saw how we could make the user interface a bit more user-friendly by reducing the number of questions that we are asking. In fact, it was quite nice. We are going to go further in that direction. We are going to allow our user to specify, let's say, multiple choices for every specification. So notice presently we allow the user to put only one preference for a specification. For example, one choice for brand, one choice for RAM, and so on and so forth. But then, this could be a bit restrictive. Sometimes people are okay buying, let's say, 2 GB RAM or 4 GB RAM, perhaps. So we want to be a little bit more flexible. We can give some flexibility to say, allow multiple preferences for every specification. For example, user may want to say that, okay, look, I'm okay with brands WDEL or WHP. Or perhaps I'm okay, as I said, with different RAMs or different screen sizes and so on. We will like to allow this multiple values to be entered in. In fact, this is quite interesting. One, this makes our project a bit more realistic, obviously. And two, from a programming perspective, this is quite interesting because the query formation now becomes somewhat very, let's say, more involved. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So clearly, there are two changes that we need to do with respect to our, let's say, class project. Number one, the user input. In fact, this is quite simple. All we need to do is to allow, let's say, comma separated values, which we can then process, for, let's say, figuring out what are the different preferences mentioned for a given specification. The important bit and the more tricky one is here the query formation. The query must be formed now keeping in mind the multiple preferences for the different specifications. Now this is best understood with some examples. So let's take some examples. Let's say, user is okay with perhaps brand being WDEL or brand being WHP. Now clearly when we add this to the query, we must put this with an OR because, basically laptop brand being WDEL is also okay. Laptop brand being WHP is also okay. So clearly this has to go in an OR because with an OR condition, either of these can be one or can be true and the whole condition is considered true. But now remember that there are multiple specifications that we are talking of. Let's say the brand, the RAM, the screen sizes, and so on and so forth. Now when we create the entire query which has all these specifications, in fact, we must enclose the query portions for individual, let's say, specifications inside brackets. This is needed because if we don't do this, then the ordering of this computation can go wrong and the whole program can fall apart. So what I mean is that, look, when we are talking for brand here, we are putting laptop brand, so I'm missing a comma here, doesn't matter, equal to WDEL or laptop brand equal to WHP. This is inside brackets, and let's say the preference for RAM is 2 GB or 4 GB. These two individually are inside, are connected with each other with an OR. Together, this has to be in a bracket, and these brackets, as earlier, have to be connected in an AND. The reason is, if I do not have the entire computation can go off. So brackets makes it, let's say, correct. Now let's get to our code and do this because that's what brings it more clarity. Basically, like I said, we are going to ask person's preference, and in fact nothing needs to change. All I just say, well, look, let's make it more concise. Let's say no say no. If you have no preference, then let's say put none. And so I just go and say maybe multiple, say comma separated. So it can specify say multiple brands, multiple RAM, and so on and so forth. And that's really all we need to do. So whatever the player is providing, just like earlier, we will let it go inside the user choice dictionary at, let's say, the key being KK, which is the spec. So for that particular spec, we now have multiple values. Obviously, we got to handle this, and we will handle this at the time of query formation. Now, this is where the query formation is going on. We will have to enhance this code a little bit. Basically, if the user's choice is none, basically, which means the user did not have a preference, nothing changes. So we just don't include that in the query. So I let it be passed. However, here I go and add a condition that, look, if my query, let's say if my user response, the user choice in that particular specification contains a comma, it means there are multiple values. So I just go and say, well, comma is in user choice, let's say KK, and I can put a colon here. Let me put a small comment over here, say multiple preferences indicated for this spec. So if this is the case, we will of course form the query in a you know keeping in mind all the preferences given. But obviously, first I must know what are those preferences. In fact, if you think about it, this is exactly the same as the problem we had earlier when we allowed, for example, the specifications for which we have a preference. So there we had a comma separated, thing coming in. We had to convert that into, let's say, a list of stuff which we use later on. So exactly same thing is going on here. We are getting, say, a comma separated, let's say, user choice. We will from here figure out what are the different choices. So I'll just do, let's say, kind of something very similar. So I'll just say, for example, so let's just say multiple choices. So just call it M choices, is, well, user choice, say, KK, and I will say split this with a comma, just like we had done earlier. And I'll convert this into, let's say, MC list, which is basically multiple choice list. I mean, just some kind of name here. So I'm just going to say, well, convert this, M choices is already a list, but I'm just going to say, well, convert this again to, a list which has all these choices, but remember with any leading or trailing spaces removed, right? So I'm going to say str.strip. This is all inside a map statement, and say M choices. Notice the similarity here and what we had done previously when we reduced the number of questions for our player. Now, having done this, basically we are going to, so this MC list, for example, contains all the, let's say, preferences that the user has indicated for this particular spec. We were going to go through this one by one. So I'm just going to say for C in, let's say, MC, let's say, list. So with this, now remember the query has to start forming with a parenthesis. I will do that by saying, look, if C is equal to MC list 0, which means that's the very first item. If that is the case, well, my query has to be query is equal to query. Now, very easy to make mistake in this, so go slow. Query plus, let's say, starting bracket, and I can then, pretty much take this, and we will of course modify this just a little bit, right? So I will go and do this here. So I'll just go and say, look, if that is the case, of course this is no longer user choice KK, this is in fact C, because now this is running up in a for loop. Also remember, the individual pieces within a given spec must be connected with an OR. So I will now just like on the very first one, we are starting with an opening bracket. On the very last one, we'll have to close it with a closing bracket. But for anything in between, we will just continue with the OR. So I'll just say, okay, look, let's say elif C is not equal to, say, MC list, say 1. Sorry, MC list say -1, because not the last value. So if it's not the last value, well, all I need to do really is to just take pretty much just this. So I'm just going to say query is equal to query plus all of this. I do not need, let's say, the bracket here. Now, being a little bit verbose, it's okay, because it kind of gives the picture here, right? On the other hand, if it's the last item, so I just put an else. Now I must close the, let's say the bracket, and I must go and put an and at the very end. So when I do this, so I must do two things over here. So this is okay. So I will go and first, let's say, close the bracket here. Again, need to be a little bit careful here. Close this string over here, plus, let's say, closing bracket, and then plus, say, and. Now we will see this working so that it becomes a little bit more clear. In fact, this is all I need to do. What I'll do is to print query as expected. So see this carefully. Basically, for the first item, we are starting the query. That's why we have a bracket. For the last item here, which is in the else, I am closing the bracket. And remember, this query is now going to merge with some other specs, and that's why I must have an and in the end. And for anything in between, I just keep adding with an or condition as we are doing. Now, let's say I want to have, say, my choice for brand. As it says, no preference, put none, multiple, put comma separated. Let's say I say W Dell, comma WHP, just for illustration sake. Notice my query that is formed is laptop brand is equal to WDEL or laptop brand is equal to WHP. In fact, if I run this, that's exactly what has happened. 9 laptops met my preference, WHP as well as WDEL, because this query ran as as we had, let's say, planned just like earlier. So really it's interesting how changing just the right part of the code, everything keeps working because we are maintaining the basic abstraction, the basic structure of the query we are not changing. We are just taking care of the new conditions here. That's a pretty interesting point to think about. Now let's say I want to specify, say, brand and also say RAM. This is, so for the brand I want to say say Dell, comma say WHP, and for RAM I want to say 2 GB, so 2, let's say, GB, and say well, maybe 8 GB. So maybe for whatever reason I have these two choices. When I do this, now look at this query, it's quite interesting. Basically, laptop brand is equal to WDEL or laptop brand is equal to WHP. This is in a parenthesis, so this gets computed first. And we are furthermore saying that, look, laptop RAM is 2 GB or laptop RAM is 4 GB. Now this and takes care of the different specifications. The brackets take care of the individual ones. So when I, let's say, run this query, notice I got all laptops which are WDEL and WHP. So it turns out must be these different models, and the RAM is either 2 GB or 8 GB. So really I made a fairly complicated query over here. It's interesting to understand how this is. Now before I wrap this up, I want to discuss something very important about logic. Now let's say we had formed this query without these brackets. So let me just go and do this here. Let me just create, I will comment it out later on. However, for now I will override the query by, let's say, doing this. So I basically change, let's say, remove one plus over here just for illustration. Notice I removed the opening bracket, and let me also go and remove the closing bracket. This is going to change the nature of the entire game, and hence it's important to understand. Let's say I did this. Notice everything is exactly the same except that now there are no brackets being used. Now I'm going to comment the first one here so that doesn't interfere with the code. Notice everything is the same except that we have now not included the the opening and the closing brackets. Now let's say when I run this, so I specify, for example, I have a choice for a brand and say, let's say, screen size. So my brand I specify to be, say, WASUS and say WASUR. And for screen size, for example, let's say I say 9-inch and say 17-inch. Very strange choice, but perhaps whatever it is. You notice now the query has been formed, but it does not have brackets. When I run this, in fact, I end up with also laptops which do not fit this requirement. I have ended up with the laptop on having 12-inch screen. And this is very strange. In fact, I have ended up sometimes even with those that are not from the correct brand. So something has clearly gone wrong here. It's interesting to understand what has happened. Why is it that now, let's say, for example, this laptop has been selected as sort of passed the query, let's say, right? Now, let's try to understand what's going on here. For this laptop, brand is WSS, which means that we are looking at first condition being true. Clearly, the next one is false because brand is WSS. It's not this. Next, we have and laptop screen size is 9-inch. Not true because screen size is, in fact, here 12-inch. So this is a false, and again this is also a false because neither 9-inch nor 17-inch. However, when I look at all this, the total answer is true because remember, an OR condition, any one of the inputs becoming 1 results in the output becoming 1. We will see this again in the bitwise operators. We'll see this again in, for example, in the Sports Heroes project. But that's the idea, that any OR condition, one of the inputs becomes true, the whole condition is true. What happens on the other hand if I had, let's say, brackets being placed at the right positions, which I was doing earlier? In that case, I am looking at this statement. Basically, I'm looking at true or false inside a bracket and false and false. And this statement is false, which means that this laptop, in fact, wouldn't sneak in, wouldn't sort of, a fool of a query, let's say, and get in. And that's why the result will be correct. The point I'm trying to make is that without those brackets, the computation goes completely off and we get wrong results because the logic looks quite flat. It doesn't have the kind of hierarchy that we want to put for, let's say, every specification and then combine the results. Which means, simple words, we do need this, let's say, statement to be there. I'm going to remove this to avoid any confusion. I'll remove this. Likewise, I will remove this and bring on this back, right? And we can now test this once again. So let's say I say brand and say, let's say RAM maybe. Um, so I say, for example, say W Lenovo, perhaps I want Lenovo, maybe W Lenovo, and say W Acer, and I want the RAM to be either say 8 GB or comma say 16 GB. Now notice the query has been formed with the brackets, and hence the results are perfectly consistent. The brands that I see are W Acer or W Lenovo as we had specified. The RAM values are also either 8 GB or 16 GB. So we have done a fairly good, let's say, filtering over here. Very flexible in some sense and quite useful. I hope you found this interesting. Lots of things to think about for this project. Happy to discuss in case you have questions. And this way of learning really brings out concepts, makes them vivid because we are applying them to a real context, which makes them, let's say, come alive. Look at our website www.ybyte.in. We always learn Python programming through such fun activities. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.